Hey folks, BlackCross here, and welcome to another video game review, guys. Today's review is going to be on Tales of Symphonia Remastered. Now, of course, this originally came out on the GameCube, and technically the PlayStation 2, but that was only a Japanese exclusive version for the PlayStation 2. That being said, it did come out on the GameCube here in the States. I remember renting it a long time ago, but I never really got around to actually quote-unquote finishing it. Well, I figured now is the perfect time as any to finally hop into it, especially seeing as how I wanted to play more traditional RPGs and everything this year. And I was like, you know what, let's play a little bit more of Tales series. The only Tales game that I've ever actually played was Tales of Berseria. And that was actually really good. I really enjoyed that game. So I figured, why not just hop into something that I already knew and just get a feel for it? Well, this review is going to be a little bit interesting because on the one hand, I did enjoy my time playing through Tales of Symphonia. On the other hand, though, comparative to like Tales of Berseria, it feels a little unfair to talk about it because, keep in mind, I've only played, up until now, one other Tales game. So I'm not really the best person when it comes to reviewing the Tales series per se. The only familiar RPG that I'm familiar with is like obviously Final Fantasy, and then of course Dragon Quest. So mostly, you guessed it, Square Enix. So this is completely off my normal radar when it comes to RPGs. But needless to say, I did enjoy myself with Tales of Symphonia. But coming off from memories of Tales of Berseria, I was a little bit off-putted by how the game played out and stuff like that. What do I mean? Well, unfortunately, unlike Tales of Berseria, where you do play as in a 3D environment and stuff like that, the way this game plays is kind of weird because, yes, you do roam around in a 3D environment. But when you're battling in combat, instead of it being like a 3D arena like you would see on screen right now, it plays more like a 2D fighter in a weird way. It's like instead of going around with an analog stick, you're mostly going left or right, depending on the situation. For example, if you were wanting to move towards the opponent and is at the left side of you, you would go to the left direction. If you wanted to move away from that same target, you move to the right direction. So basically moving away or close to the opponent, depending on the situation stuff. The up directional button, or up analog, is actually your jump command, which is weird, I thought. So it's one of those things where it's like, it's hard to say if I actually enjoyed it this way of how the game played and stuff, because again, the way that I remember playing it on Tales of Berseria, it was very much different. That being said though, once I got around to getting used to that form of combat, the rest became a little bit obvious of how it ran and stuff. Though I still had my mixed opinion about the game regardless. The AI, in my personal opinion, in terms of your allies, aren't exactly bright. What do I mean? Again, it more or less differs as to how they function. If anything, if you're familiar with, like, say, Kingdom Hearts, for example, you can change how the AI character affects itself into battle. For example, you can change Donald's spell ratio of how it's activated. For example, healing commands, or healing item for that matter, you can change it to either be as often or as rare as you like. In this game's case, you can change how the AI is programmed based on either how close or how far they are to the enemy, or what type of spells or what type of commands they should use. And I tried to move around with it and stuff like that to see if I can make it work, but I found myself realizing that this isn't nearly as good as it could have been. I'm afraid to say that, needless to say, the AI is purely dumb. But that does not mean that you don't have full control over your allies. There are ways to where you can actually change how the AI can function in terms of their commands. So, within the menu that you see right here, you have the force selection of what type of moves your character can use, whether it's default or left to right, up or down, depending on the direction. You use the circle button while pressing the direction or not pressing the direction, depending, in order to initiate the command. Now there is an L2 and R2 command, and the way that works is that you can either use your own commands that you have in your area, or you can choose a different character from their command list and select it into the L2 and R2. And this is the way that I was able to get around certain cases in which where I needed a party member to use a healing spell or a certain type of move that helps out really well. So in the end, it kind of makes sense as to how it works. But I feel like in terms of how it works, it just doesn't seem to function well for me personally. I feel like if I had more access control to that character's command, it'd be a little bit easier to use. But it was still kind of hard to get used to in some cases. In other words, instead of having the AI control the healer, I ended up actually wanting to use the healer more to where that way I had full control over it. But this wasn't necessarily a main thing that I was using, because after I got to a certain point in the game, I thought to myself, let's just level grind a little bit, you know? And the cool thing is that the game does feature an auto battle system. Basically, as you go into your character selection and stuff like that, you can go to the main character that you're controlling and choose to select auto, where the AI will actually let the character auto fight. It's not perfect, but hey, depending on your level, depends on how easy it is to get through and stuff like that. And in some cases, they're not too bad. Now obviously, if you played a Tales game, you're probably familiar with how the combat would play. And depending on how familiar you are with the Tales series, you would also be familiar with how to attain new movesets. Depending on the moveset and depending on what type of moves you're wanting to attain and stuff like that, you have to use abilities a frequent amount of times. And so depending on the number of times that you use a certain moves, you will then be able to use more moves. These, of course, vary depending on when the ratio hits. The way that I was reading it, it depends on if it gets to up to 50 uses or upwards to 200 uses, depending. So you will be using different moves on occasion in order to attain different moves for certain characters. Now, of course, that's not your only arsenal in terms of combat, whether the standard combat or your different command abilities that you can use. You also have union attacks. Union attacks is basically where the certain bar fills up, and then by pushing down on the L3 command, which is your analog, obviously, but if you press down on it, you'll be able to initiate the union attack, which will then allow you to choose upwards to 4 different attack moves, depending on the character and depending on if it can be used in a union battle or not. Say, for example, you use Rain's healing ability, that is not a union attack, and neither is Sheena's summon ability. Basically, those are not used for union attacks. But for normal fight moves and stuff like that, they are union attack moves, so depending on the situation, depends on the circumstances. Now, of course, if you're also a little bit more familiar with how union attack works, depending on 2 characters' attack moves and stuff, it can also give you access to a potential 5th union attack, which is more of a more substantial, more damaging attack. Now, I did try to use the different characters and figure out, if I like their movesets or not, but I would have to argue and say that while some of them are okay, some of them are a little bit different. For example, Lloyd is your main character that you're going to be playing most of the time. Whereas the other characters, depending on how you want to play and stuff like that, depends on how you feel. For example, Persea is a axe wielder, so maybe she's more of a physical attacker, which isn't a bad thing. But then you've got, like, say, for example, Genius. It's more of a spellcaster, so depending on how that goes, depends on how hard it could become to use spell abilities and stuff like that. Because as you're casting, it takes a little bit of time to cast those spells, so if you get hit by random attacks or whatever, it gets interrupted. So it can be a little bit tricky at times. Whereas traveling around the world, traveling around the area and stuff like that, it was actually quite relaxing, and I didn't really have any major trouble, aside from, like, say, a couple of cases in which where the bosses actually gave me a little bit of trouble. But outside of that, though, it wasn't too awful bad, really. This was actually a good way to hop into the traditional RPG sense, in the sense of, like, how, like, the Tales game has been known for, probably. Because this series has ran into from where it started on the PlayStation 1. So you gotta remember, it's got that many years of old RPG titles that I can play and everything like that. So I'm not familiar with how the gameplay mechanics originated. So for all I know, maybe it did go in terms of the directional system as to oppose the analog control that I've been used to in Tales of Berseria. Who's to say? But it's hard for me to say if I am probably the best person to rate this game in terms of how I felt and everything. Because there are some cases in which where there's a lot of features that this game has, but I didn't really use all of them. For example, there's these cat people that has the ability to help you explore the area. For example, you can give them currency, gold as it's called, but it's gold. You can give them this to where that way they can explore the area and tell you what all you're missing and stuff like that. Truth be told, I really didn't end up needing to use this ability, in all honesty. There's also the fact that you can also customize weapons and stuff like that. It would be good if you were able to earn more materials and earn more items needed. This wasn't really that case. I didn't really get that many items throughout my playthrough and stuff like that, so instead I'd just rather just fight the monsters as is and then purchase upgraded weapons whenever available. There's also the fact that the different dungeons in which where you play through the world, you go to these different dungeons either to help Colette earn angel abilities or to help Sheena earn summon abilities, depending on where you are in the story progression. I'm trying not to get too deep into the story, mostly because I'd rather you discover the story yourself, because the story is really good, in my opinion. But anyway, the dungeons, depending on the puzzle, they can range from being quite interesting to very annoying. So it's kind of interesting how it went there. It's like the very early on, the puzzle seemed interesting, but then as the later part in the game where you got more different puzzles and everything like that, they actually became a little bit harder to get through and stuff. And in some ways, a little bit annoying in my opinion. If I had to rate Tales of Symphonia Remastered, and this is coming from a remastered version. For all I know, the original version might play a little bit better. I don't know. But from what I can say from the remaster, I would give it like a 3 out of 5. It's not bad. And in my personal opinion, I feel like Tales of Symphonia is a good RPG for just a standard play and everything like that. If you're looking for a really good RPG, maybe this isn't the one that you want to step into and stuff like that. If you want a better version, Tales of Berseria is actually really good in terms of gameplay. And the story is really good too. Tales of Symphonia, gameplay is mixed, but the story is really good. You do get into it as you get further into the story and everything. The story gets a little vague at times, but as you continue progressing through the story, you start to learn a little bit more how the world works, what's going on, what's happening, and towards the end, it gets very good. It's one of those things where it's like, you start to finally get all the pieces, and then by the time you finally get to the end of the game, all of it clicks, all of it connects, and it's like, I finally get what's going on. Now I understand. So, it's not like Final Fantasy where you look at the ending and you go, what just happened? No, it's quite interesting to understand once you finally get all the pieces together. So, it's an interesting one in my personal opinion. And one that I would only recommend depending on if you are a full-on RPG fanatic, to where you want to experience something different, something new, something you may not be familiar with. Tales of Symphonia would be interesting. If you're looking for a good RPG, this might not be the one to go into per se. Again, it's a 3 out of 5. It's decent, but it's not perfect. So, anyway guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. This is BlackCross signing off. Catch you guys later.